Okay, so hello and welcome to our webinar today on sickness absence management. Um, I'm Liz Chiver and I'm the Director of Halliday's HR, and this is my colleague Lizzie Walsh, so she's our HR business partner. Halliday's HR is a HR and training consultancy based in Stockport, but we operate all over the Northwest and all over the UK, to be honest, helping small businesses that don't have their own HR teams with all things from a HR and training and development point of view. But that's not what we're here to talk about. So we are here to talk about absence management, just a few kind of housekeeping bits. We are recording today's webinar and we'll be sharing this with you afterwards, along with a copy of the slides. We've enabled your cameras, so if you want them on, brilliant. No problem at all. If you want to keep it off and you want to eat your sandwich and have a brew while you're on your lunch, while you're listening to us, that's absolutely fine as well. We have turned your microphone off though, just to, from a disturbance point of view. But if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat function and we'll come back to those. Okay, so over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at what sickness absence management is. We're going to learn the legal and practical requirements for managing sickness absence. We're going to gain tools to handle absence fairly, consistently, and lawfully, I guess most importantly. Okay, but first let's have a look at some stats then of the current status of sick leave in the UK. And to do a deep dive into how different industries are affected by the rise in sickness absence levels, in 2024, Access People HR gathered the data of absences recorded from over 1,775 small and medium-sized businesses to track their sick leave. So nationally, the report revealed that there's been an increase of 55% in sickness absence rates since 2019. And if we just look at the pie chart there, so this is the average number of sick days taken across the UK in each company. So in that pie chart, it's displaying that in 2019, there was 81 days of sick leave. In 2020, it went up to 97 days of sick leave. In 2021, there was 113 days of sick leave, 120 days in 2022, and 128 days of sick leave in 2023. And Access People HR's research also highlights that overall, sick day levels are continuing to increase significantly, with the reasons for this changing year on year across businesses, but it does go to show that it is on the up and it's expected to continue to be that way. If we just have a look at the second graph on that slide there, so this shows some industries and the levels of sickness absence. So you can see that, from the manufacturing point of view, they're really kind of feeling the brunt of sick leave and have got the highest level there. And this kind of just really highlights why we kind of felt that it was so important to discuss this topic today with you. So let's look at the impact that sickness absence can have on a business. So there's obviously, the operational impact. So that whole reduced output, missed deadlines, the increased workload for other people. You've also got the financial impact. So, the potential, the cost of cover. So whether that be agency staff, whether it's overtime, it might be loss of sales or loss of business or clients. You've also got the sick pay costs. So whether that's the statutory sick pay, or it might be that you have company sick pay. So it's, from an enhanced point of view, which is even more costly. There's also the impact that it has on team morale. So, sometimes this can kind of go unmissed, really. So, potentially the people that are kind of left behind to pick up the pieces, if you like, and to pick up the rest of the workload They could, start to feel resentment. They could suffer from burnout themselves. But also, from that whole, I guess, team building and that team cohesion point of view, it's going to have an impact from that side of things as well. Then there's not to mention, obviously, the compliance risks. So, if you do mishandle absence incorrectly, then it can lead to disputes or legal claims in an employment tribunal, potentially discrimination claims and that type of thing. So can get kind of quite serious and messy and costly. So, again, don't want to kind of bang on about, how important it is, but I guess it is just kind of painting that picture around, why it can be seen as being quite onerous in terms of managing sickness absence, but the benefits, of it and the impact, if if things do get out of control, can be quite significant. So what do we mean by sickness absence management then? So, absence management goes beyond simply recording the number of days off. It's about having the right processes, policies, and actions in place to to track attendance, to support employee well-being, and to ensure that fair, consistent management across the business. So, by approaching absence proactively, organizations can reduce the disruption, improve productivity, and create that healthier workplace culture, where employees feel supported in returning to work, but also the workforce also feels supported as a whole as well. And obviously, it can also help to deter those not so genuine cases as well. So let's have a look. Absence management. Why is it important? And the whole point of it really is to obviously balance the needs of the employee. That's really important, but it does need to tie in with those business requirements. And it is absolutely vital in maintaining that healthy and productive workforce. It helps organizations to manage the challenges that come with employee absences, and it ensures that business processes are running smoothly, inevitably. But some of the key benefits, as are on the slide there, is that it's reducing disruption to business operations. It's maintaining that productivity and that efficiency in the workplace. It's streamlining resource planning and scheduling. It's ensuring that fair and consistent handling of absences. It's improving the employee engagement. It's upholding compliance with legal requirements. And like we've said, it's supporting employees in their return to work. So let's just take a look at the different types of absence then. So you've got your short-term absence. So this is any absence that lasts for less than 4 weeks. And I know that 4 weeks can seem like quite a long time for it to class as short-term, but technically that's what we would class it as. However, more often than not, short-term will be your occasional days off due to those, minor illness, minor injuries. So it's things like your coughs, your colds, your stomach bugs, your headaches, and things like that. Obviously, so things like stress, musculoskeletal injuries, back pain, these are the most common short-term absences that are longer than a few days. And obviously depends on the sector that you're in as to, which one of those applies most. So long-term absence then. So this is absence that lasts for more than 7 weeks. So, and it, sorry?
7.
Oh, sorry. 4.
That's very generous.
Sorry, that was very generous of me. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I was thinking, I've got in my head 7 days. I'm skipping ahead to the next slide. Just ignore me. Sorry, long-term absence is any absence that lasts more than 4 weeks. And it may involve a serious illness or injury. So, potentially an operation or a broken limb, for example. But it can also quite commonly relate to extended periods of stress depression, anxiety, and maybe the more complex musculoskeletal and back pain conditions as well. And just because we like a stat, long-term absence accounts for nearly a third, so 32% of all lost working time. So it's quite a big chunk there. And then we've got the patterns. So this is where you notice that there is a pattern to someone's absence. So it might be that they're always off on a Friday, or they're always off on a Monday after City play on a Sunday. It basically allows you to record and to pay attention to these different types of things. Okay, so let's look at this now, I guess, from a bit more from a practical point of view. And I guess for us, the first point of call is looking at your reporting procedure. So from our point of view, we would say that best practice is to create a reporting procedure for all of your employees to follow. You know, basically so that everybody knows what to expect, and there's obviously consistency across the team. It might be that it is, you might have slight variations depending on, maybe you've got, I don't know, engineers on the road or something like that, which you, or a shop floor, which you might have different start times, different managers, that type of thing. So you could, have a couple of different processes, but just so long as, as a general rule, there is some consistency across those and across the business. In terms of what it should include, so, it's looking at who should they contact and by what time do they need to contact you by. Normally, obviously, it's, either a manager or HR, office manager, that type of thing, and sometime before their start time, sorry. So whether you deem that half an hour or 2 hours or the night before, whatever you deem to be appropriate is absolutely fine to include. It should also include how to report it. So we would always advocate that if, put phone call rather than a text or an email or social media or that type of thing, just because if people know that they actually have to speak to somebody about their absence, then, potentially it's a deterrent to those that, maybe aren't so genuine. But also, from your point of view, you're able to get more information than just that quick point of contact. And then you should also specify what information they should provide. So again, what we would recommend is that, like we said, they should be phoning in, and that they should provide information around the nature of the illness or injury. So basically what they're off with, how long they expect to be off with. So I guess, with your short-term absence, potentially it's only a day, or they might, or they might not know. But if it's, a broken leg, for example, they might know that, it's at least 2 weeks, and then we'll see where we are. For them to give you their contact details, so just make sure that you've got their home email address, you've got their mobile number, you've got their home phone number. You can maybe even check their emergency contact details, just in case you need any of those. And then finally, it's about, making sure that any outstanding or urgent work is handed over. So is there anything in the diary that needs to be done? Is there any meetings that need to be moved? And that type of thing, so that from a continuous workplace point of view, that you're covering all of those things. We then say that they should ring in every single day, so each subsequent day of absence, unless you've agreed otherwise. So obviously, if you know that they've got a broken leg and they've got a fit note for 2 weeks, which has signed them off completely, it might be overkill to say you have to ring in every day, because nothing is going to change within those 2 weeks. So you might just say, look, we'll touch base in 2 weeks' time, and I'll give you a call then, or, whatever that may be. In exceptional circumstances, I guess, just to mention that, obviously if someone is unable to ring in for themselves, maybe they're in hospital or they're in a really kind of bad way from anxiety point of view, then obviously it is okay for someone to ring in on their behalf and to make contact with you. And just to say that if people don't follow your reporting procedure, so either they're not following it but genuine sick, or they've gone AWOL, then potentially you can consider this a disciplinary offence and to follow your disciplinary procedure for handling that. So in terms of the evidence of sickness, then, this is where my 7 days comes in, get to it eventually. So for absences of up to 7 calendar days, an employee is required to fill out what we call a self-certification of absence form, or what's known as an SCA. So this is basically an internal template for the employee to complete and for you to keep on their file. Obviously giving details around, what they've been off with, whether they saw a GP, whether they're fine to, whether there's any medication and that type of thing, just a bit more detail around their absence. And then for absences of more than 7 calendar days, they need to provide a fit note, or whatever it's called, obviously doctor's note, whatever you want to call it, but its official name is a fit note. Normally this comes from the GP, or it might be the hospital, but it might also come from a pharmacist or a consultant or a physiotherapist. So don't get too suspicious. If you see one come from those places, GPs have kind of widened it out, the scope of who can kind of issue a fit note now, because there was quite a lot of pressure on GP practices. And they're just taking that away. So just because it comes on there from there, it is legitimate. So don't be worried too much about that. A fit note will obviously state what the person is suffering from. It will also state whether the employee is fit for work or not fit for work. It might also state that they're fit for work with some restrictions. And it'll also give a time frame for it as well. So, from the restrictions point of view, you're not under any obligation to provide those light duties or light hours, whatever it might be. If you can't accommodate those, then the employee will simply remain off sick until the end of that fit note. But obviously, if you can aid that gradual kind of introduction to the workplace, that it is really helpful and can mean that people are not off for a significant amount of time, makes it much easier to get back to full fitness. If the absence continues, then obviously further medical certificates must be provided. And in order to be paid continuously, they must provide certificates for the full continuous absence without any breaks. So you can withhold pay if there is any breaks within their cover. So and they could, but bear in mind they'll also be able to backdate it if there is a gap between their fit notes, for example. They can go back to the GP and get it backdated. Okay, moving on to sick pay then. So we've got SSP. So to qualify for SSP, there's kind of some criteria that an employee must meet in order to qualify for SSP. So these are that they must have an employment contract. They must have done some work under that contract. They must earn an average of £125 per week, and they must give notice and proof of illness. Okay. The SSP rate is set by the government in April every year, and it goes up in April every year. So currently it is set at a rate of £118.75 per week. Then qualifying days for SSP, these are the days that an employee would normally be required to work. So if somebody works Monday to Friday, then their qualifying days for the sake of SSP are Monday to Friday. Obviously, work shifts, it's a different kind of kettle of fish, but the same principle applies. In terms of waiting days, then, so no SSP is payable for the first 3 consecutive days of absence. So these are what we call the waiting days. So SSP starts on the 4th day of absence, and then it's paid for up to 28 weeks after that. So once the SSPs run out, the employee can fill out an SSP1 form, and then they basically are requesting to gain some either universal credit or employment support allowance. Okay. It's just worth noting under this waiting days is that under the new Employment Rights Bill, in April 2026, the government is going to scrap the 3 waiting days, and they're going to make all absences payable from day one, obviously assuming that they still meet that criteria that we've just spoken about. So, just be aware of that. Potentially it might lead to increased levels of sickness absence within the business because, people are going to get paid something, even though it's not potentially a lot, they're still going to get paid something from the first day of absence. So, if you're an SME, potentially this is quite costly from a sick pay point of view. And then just to touch on company sick pay. So you might have company sick pay yourself. You might just pay SSP. It does vary from company to company. And, there's no right or wrong in terms of these schemes. It is completely up to the employer as to whether you have one and what it looks like. But, some examples of, that we've seen is that, potentially they might require employees to have been with the company for a certain amount of time. It might be, it kicks in after probationary period or a certain number of years service, or it might be staggered in years service to get more and more as a result of loyalty. Or, it might be slightly different for different levels of people within the organization. It really does depend, like I've said, and anything is possible, really. And then the obviously in terms of withholding sick pay, so like I mentioned on the other slide, if an employee is absent without a fit note, then you are entitled to withhold their contractual sick pay or their SSP after those 7 days. Okay, so next we just want to look at return to work interviews. And it has been found that carrying out a return to work interview is one of the most effective ways to manage attendance and to reduce absence. So it's a really good way to see the reasons behind the absence. And you can obviously, have conversations around, reducing absence levels, getting them back into work sooner. You might be able to discuss, support them in their absence and to discuss those workplace adjustments. We would highly recommend that doing them after every absence, irrespective of the length of absence. So I know this can seem like a bit of a pain in the bum, because obviously it does involve a conversation and, maybe logistics or whatever. It might mean that you're not face to face with people all the time, but you can have these conversations over the phone, on Teams, on FaceTime. In person's great, but whatever means, just it's all about having a conversation with somebody after they've been off sick. And it just allows you to obviously have that open conversation, but it also gives you that paper trail. So you can obviously, even if the conversation is very, very quick, because, if they've been off with a cough or a cold or whatever, it's not going to be a lengthy conversation, but you can fill it out on the return to work form, put it on their file, and obviously kind of keep it there so that, next time they're off sick, you can potentially look at that. And it does mean that, you're keeping a track of things and things don't get kind of carried away and you're not left kind of scratching your head and racking your brains in terms of, oh God, like, when were they off last time? what were they off with then? What did we say about this? You know, it just gives you a very clear a process. And also people know what to expect. If it's going to happen after every absence, people are like, oh, do you know what? It's not kind of picking and choosing which absences get the return to work kind of conversation. They know and expect that it's going to happen after every single time. And I guess just to say that it is also really good as a deterrent for those maybe unauthorized or non-genuine sickness absences. If they know that, you know, if they've rang in sick, which obviously people don't want to speak to somebody if they're going to have to, you know, lie to somebody over the phone if they're not genuine from their sickness point of view. But then they know that after they've been sick, they're also going to have to sit down with their manager and have a conversation around what they were off with, whether they went to the doctor, all of those things. And again, potentially lie to somebody's face. It's not something that people are really keen to do. And, you know, it makes it much less easy to, you know, to kind of take these odd days off from those non-genuine cases. So just something to think about there. But back to the return to work meeting itself and how that kind of should be run. So we always kind of advise that it should be warm. So it's an acronym. So the W stands for welcoming, the A stands for absence, the R stands for reinforcing, and the M stands for move on. So from the welcoming, the W, this is basically, you know, you want to be creating that, you know, that friendly, open, non-hostile kind of environment between you and the employee. It is about welcoming the employee back to work, you know, making sure that, you know, they are fit for work and, you know, that you're actually, you know, you're interested in them, you're interested in their well-being. And, you know, it is that encouraging that two-way conversation, really, I guess, making sure that they're aware that it's not a formal meeting of any kind, and that it is, you know, just an informal chat. Then from the absence point of view, obviously you will be discussing their absence. Okay, so it is, you know, what absence it is, have they suffered with it before? Are they taking any medication for it? Have they seen a GP? Are they under a consultant? Do we need to think about whether we have to get consent to get a GP report, or do we want them to see an occupational health advisor? Or are there any other reasonable adjustments that, you know, either on a permanent basis or on a temporary basis that we need to consider? So it's about having that whole conversation to make sure, you know, that that they're fit for work, and that we're making sure that, you know, we've got a duty to protect their health and safety at work. So it's covering off those bases as well. Okay. And then the reinforcing, so the R, this is where we would look at any patterns in their attendance. So probably before you have the return to work meeting, it would be to look at, you know, over the last 12 months or whatever, it might be to look at, what have you got on file? Have you got any self-certificate of absence forms, so SCAs? What did their return to work say? Have they been off before? What does your absence tracker say? What have they been off with? How long have they been off? And how many periods of absence that is? Are there any patterns with it? So as we mentioned before, is it every Monday? Is it the last Friday of every month? Is it, you know, is there any patterns in terms of the absence type? So are they always off with a stomach bug, or always off for a headache, or things like that? Anything that kind of triggers in your mind to say, okay, we need to have a conversation about this. But then it's also, if you do have what we call triggers, so if you have a formal absence management procedure, which Lizzie's going to talk to you about in a minute, it's about looking at that and thinking, right, do they trigger for a formal meeting? Is their absence levels basically getting out of control? And do we need to, you know, invite them to a meeting outside of this particular informal meeting? And obviously you can let them know that within the return to work meeting. Even if it's, they haven't hit a trigger at the minute yet, you might want to just say to them, look, if your policy's, I don't know, 3 periods of absence in a 12-month period, for example, you might want to say, you've had 2 periods in a 12-month, you've had 2 absences, sorry, in a 12-month period. If you have another one, potentially it would trigger and we might end up in a formal meeting. So you're just setting those expectations quite clearly there. And then the M then, so finally, this is basically means move on. So this is where you will update them on what's happened whilst they've been off sick. If they're obviously off for a short period of time, it probably won't take very long. A quick catch up in terms of what happened while they were off, whether you moved their meetings, that type of thing. If it's a longer period that somebody's been off, you might want a bit of a more planned return. But, chatting them through, allocating work for the day, the week ahead, but basically then drawing a line under that absence and just, cracking on from there. Okay. I guess it goes without saying, but for the avoidance of doubt, always record on a return to work interview form and then save on their personnel file. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to Lizzie now, who's going to look at the absence management procedure.
Thanks, Liz. So yeah, obviously it starts there, literally with just what Liz has said about the return to work. But in terms of the actual formal procedure and what we would recommend is a process to manage an employee's absence. Now, obviously, if you do have a sickness absence policy, please do check your own procedure. Don't assume that it is the same as this, because it potentially isn't. But if you don't have one, feel free to pinch this one. But this can be used for both short-term and long-term sickness absence, so you don't have to have 2 separate procedures for the 2 different types of absence. In terms of what to cover at each meeting, we don't have enough time obviously today to go over that. But obviously if you need any help in creating an absence management procedure, or maybe you've got a sickness absence case that you're struggling to manage, or you need to know where to start, then please do drop us a message. But ultimately, if an employee continues to have periods of absence, so the short-term absence, they might trigger in line with the policy like Liz said, or it might be that they continue to be on long-term sickness absence, you can hold a stage 1 first sickness absence meeting. And generally the purpose of that meeting is to discuss the reasons for absence. Is there an underlying health condition, and look at, can we agree a way forward? So is it that we're advising that there are no further periods of absence within a time frame, so you can kind of almost set a required improvement, or it is can they return to work? If they're long-term sick, are we in a position to be able to agree that return to work? However, if the absence continues, be it again, like I say, short-term or long-term, then you can move to what we call a formal stage 2 meeting. Very similar to a stage 1 meeting in terms of the purpose and what you might consider, but potentially at this meeting, you might also consider seeking medical advice to obviously look at whether or not you need to be considering reasonable adjustments and looking at, maybe it's about accommodating a phased return to work if somebody has been on long-term sick. However, if you are in a position, where an employee is not able to return to work, or their absence just simply isn't improving, then you could consider terminating employment, and that would be done at that stage 3 final sickness absence meeting. And I just want to mention, obviously, disability. So when managing sickness absence, you do need to be mindful of whether an employee has a disability, because this would class as a protected characteristic. So it does need to be taken into account, because that can cause risk, I guess, if you're looking to terminate an employee if they have a disability. So in terms of what is a disability there, as you can see, under the Equality Act 2010, if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities, then an individual would be classed as having a disability. And when I say substantial, this means that something is more than minor or trivial. So for example, it might take a disabled individual much longer to complete a daily task, for example, getting dressed. And when we're talking about long term, we're talking about 12 months plus. Okay, so they're the two main factors, I guess, that you have to take into account. Obviously, occupational health would be able to help in terms of, categorically determining if somebody does have a disability. But there are also learning disabilities or learning difficulties, and if they are severe enough and fall under that criteria, they could also constitute a disability. There are also progressive conditions, which, as it is, it's one that gets worse over time, and people with progressive conditions can ultimately be classed as disabled. And then there are also conditions where an individual would automatically meet the disability definition under the Equality Act from the day that they are diagnosed. So this is conditions such as HIV, cancer, or multiple sclerosis. And indeed, individuals that have been registered as blind are also automatically considered disabled. So, it does get a little bit complicated in all honesty. There are also hidden disabilities, and I think sometimes people don't necessarily want to disclose that they have a disability. I do still think that there is a stigma around people thinking that they will be treated differently, if they are, open in disclosing a disability. And a hidden disability, is a disability ultimately that, we can't see by physically looking at someone. So some examples include Crohn's disease, diabetes, arthritis, epilepsy, and just because you can't see them, I think they can sometimes go unnoticed, but ultimately, they can be impacting on why somebody is struggling with their health. These celebrities here all have hidden disabilities. Jennifer Aniston has dyslexia. Johnny Depp is visually impaired. Albert Einstein, I'm led to believe, had Asperger's syndrome, and Elton John has epilepsy. So just because it's not something that you can physically see doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't exist. So just something to be mindful of there. And where an employee is disabled, apologies if the slide is a bit fuzzy. We realised that when we were looking at it earlier, but hopefully when we send it through and it's a bit smaller, it will read better. But ultimately, where an employee is disabled, you as an employer do have an obligation to consider making reasonable adjustments to support them in the workplace. And adjustments will vary depending on the specific circumstances. They will also vary from person to person. So please don't assume that, you've got one employee that is in a wheelchair and we made this adjustment, that therefore another employee in a wheelchair needs the same adjustment. You do need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But just in terms of some examples of perhaps what could class as a reasonable adjustment, so using the wheelchair example, it could be that they're struggling to get to the office because, they're only comfortable in a wheelchair for short distances or periods of time. So the reasonable adjustment potentially could be that, the employer provides an accessible car parking space near the office entrance. Maybe there's a bit of flexibility in terms of them being able to work from home. Maybe you could provide a taxi for the commute, and make sure that they've got that accessible work area so they're not in their wheelchair for as much time. If you've got an employee with epilepsy who can sometimes struggle with drowsiness, perhaps in the morning, a reasonable adjustment could be to kind of look at, is there any flexibility? Could they start work a little bit later when they know that they're less productive? You might be able to agree a degree of flexibility with when they take their breaks, etc. So it's just about having that conversation with the individual. And what's reasonable will depend on each situation, but you do just need to consider carefully, ultimately, if the adjustment will remove or reduce the disadvantage for the person with the disability, that it is practical to make, that it is affordable, and also consider whether or not it could harm the health and safety of of others. So it's not to put other people at a detriment just purely because you're making an adjustment for an individual with a disability. And the expectation will also be different for companies. So take the NHS for example, large organisation, they would be expected to make far more reasonable adjustments than us at Halliday's HR, where there are only 3 employees. So, you know, it is a grey area in terms of what is reasonable, but there is also that to take account of. But one thing that you can do when looking at reasonable adjustments, and perhaps the ones that the employee might have suggested, or an occupational health or a medical professional has suggested, is to do what's called an impact assessment. So basically to look at, you know, you might look at the financial aspect, you might look at a health and safety aspect, you know, various different areas that you could look at, and essentially you rag rate them in terms of whether or not, you know, it is reasonable to make or not. You know, and you've got that evidence then to be able to kind of demonstrate that ultimately you have considered making reasonable adjustments. And I think there is a misconception that you cannot dismiss an employee due to sickness absence. However, a dismissal for sickness absence, you know, it can be done. It needs to be done fairly, you know, and it would be classed as having been done fairly if you followed a fair process. You know, and ultimately the dismissal is deemed as reasonable. So as I've said, you know, you do need to consider all reasonable adjustments, explore alternative work options. Sometimes we might need to look at whether or not, you know, we can redeploy somebody into a different role before resorting to dismissal. So dismissal should always be the last resort, you know, and you, as the employer, you know, would be required to demonstrate that, you know, the employee's absence has had a significant impact on the business, and that ultimately there's no reasonable prospect of a return to work or an improvement in their absence record, and therefore, you know, there's no alternative but to consider dismissal. But we would all, you know, always say before you make such a decision, please do obviously seek the appropriate advice. Because it can get quite costly if you get it wrong. So if somebody was to make a claim for unfair dismissal and they won, an employment tribunal can award a compensatory amount of the greater of 1 year's salary, or £118,223, and in addition a basic award up to a maximum of £21,570, and that goes up every April just like the SSP rates. In addition to that, you know, if somebody is making a claim for discrimination and they are successful, you know, so the disability ultimately would be disability discrimination that they could potentially claim. Any award for discrimination claim is uncapped. So I couldn't even give you a figure in terms of how much it might cost you, because there isn't one. But an employment tribunal may also decide to give an award for injury to feelings as well as for financial loss. And very recently, it's been going on for quite a while, but unanimous decision, an employment tribunal actually awarded an individual almost £4.6 million for disability discrimination. I won't go into all the details, but essentially the claimant was dismissed in 2018 whilst on long-term sick. They had a diagnosis of ADHD. The employer was aware of it. They had that constructive knowledge that this individual had ADHD. The individual had also suffered with PTSD because the previous role that they held was supporting the response to the Grenfell Tower fire. So there was a formal diagnosis of PTSD, and that was shortly before she joined this employer. But ultimately the tribunal claimed that, you know, the company failed to follow a full and fair process in relation to the dismissal and the claimant's subsequent appeal. So, you know, in a nutshell, you know, please make sure that you're doing things right, because it can end up being quite costly. So just to summarize, I guess, and to ensure that, ultimately when it comes to managing sickness absence, it doesn't give you a headache, some practical tips. So make sure that you do have a clear written sickness absence policy. Make sure that you share it with your team, so things like the reporting procedures, what your triggers are, the team know that. So, you're setting those expectations. Keep those accurate and confidential records, all your forms, all your paperwork. Be consistent in your approach when it comes to managing sickness absence, so avoiding any favoritism or different rules for different people. Obviously, consider making those reasonable adjustments where you can, but ultimately it's about balancing empathy with, the operational needs of the business. Okay. So quite a bit to consider there, I fully appreciate. Just in terms of how we can help, we do have sickness absence management packages on our website that include the recommended policy, the procedure, relevant absence forms that we've mentioned. And we do also have more of an enhanced package that includes the various letters that you would need for holding your absence review meetings. We've also got some free downloadable checklists for managing short and long-term absence, which are available from our website. But, if you do have a specific case that you want some advice on, it might be that you've only got SSP and you want to have a chat about, how you introduce company sick pay and what that might look like. We can help with all of that too. So please do drop us a message or give us a call. And finally, just to finish off, we do have our 1 and 2 day line manager training that covers sickness absence, goes into a lot more detail than obviously the time we've had today. But also a number of other topics. So just on the slide there, our next 2 day course is the 21st and 22nd of October, and the 1 day course is on the 2nd of December. So please do contact us directly if you want to book your space or you've got any employees or team members that you feel would benefit. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions in the chat box?
Sorry, I was just going to say that obviously on the line manager dates and and the checklists and things like that, we'll obviously send you the slides in an email, but we'll also send the links to the checklists and packages and things so that you've got those handy in that email as well. Any other questions then before we let you get on with the rest of your afternoon?
No.
Okay, well, thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime. And yeah, hope to see you soon. Take care.
Bye.